So with most of our world set up, I think it's a good idea for us to start looking at some additional little touches that we can do to really just drive the entire thing home. Now, the first thing I want to do is I'm going to get each of these spotlights and I'm going to activate what's called an IES profile on them. So I'm control clicking on all of them, then I'm hitting F4. Now, I'm already reasonably happy with the light levels and how everything's looking, but one thing that's kind of sticking out to me the more I look at this is that when light's being cast from this globe up here, it's automatically casting this perfect arc coming out of it that I really like the silhouette of, but it's also not quite the right shape. It doesn't really have the slight issues that a realistic one would have. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to the light, and under IES texture, I'm going to set it to complex IES. Now when I set this up, essentially an IES is a format provided by light manufacturers that actually mimics the lighting that would come from the real globe. So if I move close to it, you can see it actually now has this banding happening of where the globe itself has curvature and creates a slightly more realistic effect. It's a very little touch, but it goes a long way in kind of like driving everything home as a realistic environment. So once this is in, if I wanted to, the other option I would actually have is I can use the IES intensity, which allows me to use the actual the brightness that is provided by the IES profile. So this can be pretty good, and it can also look, it can look quite nice and it can provide reasonably accurate results. You've got to be aware that when you activate this, you are going to want to do a lighting build to see how it's coming out. So we'll just quickly knock one of those out now. So now that the lighting's rebuilt, we've got a finished scene that's looking pretty good as far as the lighting's concerned. But there is one thing that I would like to do as well, and that's just a final touch that goes a long way and can actually sometimes have some pretty dramatic effects with the look. I'm going to go up to the top here, and I'm going to do a build, but this time, instead of setting the build to be a preview build like we have been, I'm actually going to crank it all the way up to production level. Now, production level building takes a bit longer to do, and by a bit, well, sometimes it can be quite substantial. So you've got to be wary of that. But it's really what you want to do before you ever, push it online or send it to a client or anything like that. So I'm going to turn that on now. So the lighting has been built now for production quality, and you may notice a difference, you may not. For me, I can definitely see some areas that it's definitely had some effect. What's really important to note is that with production quality lighting, it really makes sure that a lot more lighting calculations are done, so your lighting results are just substantially more accurate. Sometimes this can have the effect of actually brightening up areas that you previously didn't realize we're going to get a whole lot of just indirect lighting to end up, to end up in a certain way. And consequently, it can be kind of a bit of a problem if you only ever do your production lighting builds at the end. So I do suggest kind of doing them incrementally. Because we were doing just a very small scene, I kind of left it towards the end. But if you are ever doing a large-scale production, be sure to do one at least at the end of every day so you've got a rough idea of how things are going to look. Okay, so now that we've got the production lighting out of the way, it's time for us to start looking into creating some new things. So I'm going to go down to my content browser, and I'm going to open up the effects folder. I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to create myself a new particle system. So the point of this particle system is just going to be to add tiny little specks of dust that are floating through the air in the scene. Now you may not want this, you may want this, but it's a good idea to know how particle systems work. So I'm going to call this p_dust mode. It'll do. I've already got an example of this if you ever need it in the example folder, but I'd rather you try and do this from scratch so you have a better idea of how things are all set up. Now I'm going to drag this particle system that I just created into the world, and we'll see how it all looks. So I'm going to double click on it. And the second I do, you can see that we're rendering in the real world as well as in here. Now this is one of those things that's going to take a little bit of understanding to get used to what you're seeing. But just be aware that with that in the world, we're eventually going to see the results here. So I'm going to place this on the ground because I know that I'm going to be building it as if it's dust that's been calculated from ground level. At which point I'm going to go into Cascade and start modifying it. Now, Cascade is one of those things that can be a little scary when you first open it up. There's a whole bunch of things you haven't seen before, but to be honest, it's reasonably straightforward, especially when we're doing something like this. Over here, we have the viewport, which shows me how the effect currently looks. Over here, we have my current emitter and all of its modules. So you have to look at these modules as if they're a stack of instructions. Essentially, the emitter processes this information, then this information, then this, then this, then this, then this. And if I right click, I'm able to add additional information and instructions that each particle is then going to follow. So in this situation, what we essentially want to do initially is we need to get this actually spreading across the room. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to add myself a new module. It's going to be a location, and it's going to be a module that affects the initial location of the particle. So when I click on initial location, we're given this visual over here. Now in the details panel, you'll see that we have a max and a min. And all this means is when a particle is first created, its location can be anywhere between 0 and 0 on the x-axis, 0 and 0 on the y, and 0 and 0 on the z. So if I was to change this to, say, negative 400, you can now see that my particles are spawning anywhere between negative 400 on the x and 0 on the x. So if I change this negative 400 through to 400, you can now see that the particles are spreading anywhere along that axis. Now, for the time being, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get rid of my initial velocity. By default, particles are told to just raise up in the air with a slight bit of left and right movement, but I don't really want that, so I'm going to delete it, and now they're just going to bleep into existence. So the next thing that I'm going to do is on the y-axis, I'm going to do the same thing. Oops. And if I was to look above it, you can now see that they're just spawning along a plane of negative 400 to 400 on the x and y axes. The final thing to do is to get the dust motes spawning anywhere between 0, which means at the emitter's height, and 400 units above it. And you can now see that the emitters are all popping in a rectangular prism. So this is how we're going to spawn the motes. And if I go into the world here, you can see that they're all filling this area here quite nicely. Obviously though, these don't quite look like dust just yet, so it's about time we actually structured them. The first thing that I'm going to do is make sure that the movement and everything else for the dust mote is kind of what I want. And then I'm going to go through and I'm going to set up a material that works with that. So the first part of the movement is that dust motes should probably be slowly accelerating towards the ground. So I'm going to go acceleration, and I'm going to go constant acceleration, and I'm just going to set this to, let's go negative 20. Just try that. You can now see that when the dust motes pop in, they're going to spawn and slowly fall towards the ground. I feel like that's probably a little bit too quick, so I'm going to change this from negative 20 on the Z to negative 10. It's probably looking a little bit nicer. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to alter the size. Now by default, these values over here aren't actually necessary. You see we have x, y, and z, x, y, and z. But how particles work initially is they're perfectly squared. And because they're perfectly squared, the only actual value that they consider is the x-axis. You can set them up to take into account the other axes to make them into rectangles and such, but in this situation, we're totally fine with squares. The problem is the current square that's being created is being told to be between 25 and 25, which is quite large, because that's 25 centimeters for a single particle, when in reality we want them to be between 1 and 2 centimeters. Now, they're a little tricky to see now that we've shrunk them down that much, so I'm going to turn it up, and then I'm going to affect this again afterwards. There we go. So you can see them at this point, still popping in every now and then. And now the next thing that I'm going to want to do is I don't want them cycling around and being created so frequently and destroying themselves so frequently. So I'm going to go up to my lifetime module. Now at the moment, every particle that's created lasts between 1 and 1 seconds. But in reality, I want every particle to last between 4 and let's say 10 seconds. This way when they're created, we can see them falling for a bit longer. The more I look at how these particles are kind of existing in the world, I kind of want to slow the acceleration down even further. So I'm going to go ahead and tweak that again. One thing that's worth noting is that when it comes to particles, it's definitely more art than science. You're going to tweak a lot of numbers until you just get a good feel for them. That's good. -4 seems nice. May even go -2 though. So the next thing, now that that's in, is I'm going to add a little bit of chaos to them. I want them kind of spiraling around a little bit. I don't want them just falling straight down. And a nice way to do that is with the Orbit module. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to go Orbit. Essentially, Orbit gives them a random rotation that circles around the current point in space that you're seeing them at now. When I look at this in the world, it currently looks like this, which is pretty chaotic. Essentially what I need to do is set these up to have an orbit that's far, far, far slower, but still has a little bit of that round movement to imply that the dust is kind of just getting caught in subtle breezes that we can't see. So, in the Orbit module, I'm going to click on it, and you'll see that there's a section called Rotation Rate Amount, just here. It's under Rotation Rate. I'm going to open that up, and at the moment they're being told to cycle between 0 and 1 seconds in a full loop around the x-axis, around the y-axis, and around the z-axis. How I want to structure this instead is to go on the x between 0 and 0. I'm going to go 0.5, 0.05, I'm going to say 0.1. You can now see that some of them have this nice little bit of movement to them. It's very subtle. Fantastic. So that's the dust movement kind of taken care of. The next part is obviously making the dust actually look like dust. We'll cover that in the next lesson.